Welcome all. We're going to give it 1 or 2 minutes for people to come in from the Quantum Internet sponsored talk. People are still coming in, so but we're already very happy to have you all here. So, and while you are here, you can already take some time to sign in to Meet Echo. This is important for us, so we know how many people are here. So this is the equivalent of the blue sheets. So please make sure that you log in either via using your camera, scanning the QR code, or just going straight into Meet Echo. That will be all very much appreciated. Just checking for the people at home. Do you see and hear us well? Very good. That's very nice to hear. Good. So we're all one happy participating hybrid family. Very nice. So as you probably have gotten, this session is being recorded. And for the in-person participants, as said, it would be great if you could sign into Meet Echo, use Meet Echo to join the mic queue, but some lining up is also fine. Please wear a mask unless actively speaking at the microphone or directly eating or drinking. We'll try to do this as well. Remote participants, make sure your audio and video are off unless you are chairing or presenting during a session, and please use a headset. We're in Thursday, so probably you've noted the note well, but still it's very important. We're going to talk about intellectual property, measuring it, but as you know, the IETF follows the IETF intellectual property rights disclosure rules. So if you haven't looked at them, please do. It is quite important. So the more happy news. Welcome to the first and inaugural session of the Research and Analysis of Standard Setting Processes Proposed Research Group. We are your co-chairs, and we're quite nice, Ignacio and Niels. And we're starting with welcome, introduction, and most of all, agenda bashing. Has anyone got anything to add or change to the agenda? Very good, because we quite a full agenda with lots of cool and fun stuff. So you are here in RASP, and as you know, RASP is an ancient but very good tool to make things better. And that's actually what we try to do here. We try to make standard setting better by getting better informed at how it works and how it actually functions in society. As you know, standard setting is a practice that goes back 3 centuries before Christ to the Haparandan civilization in the Indus Valley, where it's now currently Pakistan, but we still don't really understand how it works. So we had some time, but we'll also take some time to understand it even better. So let's get ready to RASP. The objective of this research group is to bring together researchers, practitioners, policymakers, standards users, and standards developers to study standards processes in and across SDOs. We want to inform the comprehension of standardization processes and policies, and possibly provide tools and insights to do so.
And what can we do? Well, we can do lots of things, because one of the cool things of the IETF and some other standardization bodies as well is that they have lots of data available from even before the internet itself started. So we can look at the demographics of a standard setting, how people have joined IETF or other standardization bodies, how the affiliation has evolved, how some of those people have become leadership, how leadership has evolved, how communities have been created and how those communities have evolved, how diverse they are and what is the impact of that diversity on the standard setting process. We can also look at decision-making process. Is the community more agreeable, more disagreeable? How has that evolved over time, and how does it depend on the specific topic that we are looking at and the makeup of the people that are part of that decision process? It's also quite interesting to look at the standards and patents. There is an interesting relationship there, and it could be quite cool to see what that relationship is. Same with the scientific community. What does lead, research or standards or patents? So triangulating between those three would be also, from our point of view, something quite interesting to look at. But this is just a sample of the many different things that could be done. Some of them, we are already doing them. And what do we want to do? Well, what we would like to do is to produce open source tools, hackathons, produce methodologies that allow us to analyze these processes, this data, create data sets that can be used by other people, for example, labeling them. We are doing that currently for agreement and disagreement in the email discussions, organize workshops to focus on specific aspects, and overall produce evidence-based reproducible work.
And we can proudly say that this has been one of that before we came into the IRTF, we've already worked in 3 hackathons to work on this work. So we can really say we are a code first and not talk first endeavor, which might be really nice. What is very important to know that there are also some non-objectives. So we do not want to do a hierarchical comparison between SDOs, because we don't think that's a productive engagement, or directly influence IETF operations. We are here for knowledge production and understanding for all different involved stakeholders, and do not concretely provide advice on operations.
Yeah, the goal for us is rather produce data, evidence, and analysis that other people might leverage to make those judgments. But that's not what we do here.
So what we would really like from you is for you to share your code, your analysis findings, but also your assumptions about standard setting and your research questions. Because, you know, we might just be able to answer them or find new ways in which we cannot answer them, and then innovate on that.
Questions in general. If you have an operational pain point that you think that could be somehow answered or alleviated by looking into the data, we are your guys.
And of course, also suggesting for interesting presenters and research methods. Luckily, we already found some for you, and for the first RASP talk, which will be held, will be a qualitative IETF data researcher who has done some excellent work on this in writing her PhD, also an ANRP prize winner and a longtime IETF participant. Please welcome Corinne Kath.
Hi, everyone. Niels just piled on the pressure. Thank you. I appreciate it. Do you have a clicker for the slides? I
don't, but I have a quick question, so I can relax you a bit. So, is there a note taker? The note taker doesn't need to take notes from the presentations, just from questions and comments. Is someone willing to take notes? Yes, thank you so much. So we have 2. If you do it collaboratively, in the note-taking tool, that will be super appreciated, and then it should not be too much work. Thanks so much. Very kind.
Thank you.
Perfect. So super happy to be here. Very excited for this first meeting. Interestingly, most of the data that I used for the research that I've done on the IETF has not come from the work that you've done, but actually shows a different perspective, namely collecting and using qualitative data about how the IETF works. And today I want to sort of put that in context by giving an example of what it means to use ethnography to study power and politics in the IETF. Next slide, please. So this is what I'll be doing. I'll give a bit of an introduction, talk about ethnography, which is a qualitative method used by social scientists, give a bit of a case study drawing from my PhD work on the IETF, and then move to next steps, but mostly Q&A. Bit of an introduction. Hi, my name is Corinne. I'm an anthropologist of internet governance. I am currently a research affiliate at the Minderoo Center for Democracy and Technology at the University of Cambridge, also a fellow at the Critical Infrastructure Lab in Amsterdam, and I'll be starting a postdoc focusing on the topics that I'll be talking about today in Delft over the summer. Next slide. And it's interesting to know for this purpose that I actually wrote my PhD about the IETF. And in particular, I look at how the cultural conditions here shape what kind of discussions happen and what kind of standards get built. I've been participating since 2015, so I'll leave it up to you to decide if that was a good way to spend the latter half of my 20s and early 30s, but it's definitely led to a lot of interesting insights into how internet governance bodies work on paper versus in practice, which is also what I think the unique contribution that ethnography as a method can bring to understanding what all of you do here today. Now, what I'll be doing today is putting IETF culture into critical view by looking at how standardization works in practice, especially because I think I found some interesting discrepancies between the IETF on paper, or even how some people describe it and how it works in practice. Now, one of the things that I ask in my PhD is how suitable is the IETF to the participation of civil society folks? And when I say civil society in this case, I mean people who work for non-governmental organizations with a public interest mandate. So to make that a bit more concrete, DKG, who I'm sure most of you will know, he works for the American Civil Liberties Union. Speaking of the literal devil, hi DKG. This is DKG. He works for a civil society organization. Another example is, for instance, Mallory Nodal, who's in the IAB. She works for the Center for Democracy and Technology. So I'm trying to figure out how well folks from those kind of organizations can be here and participate here. Now, on the face of it, when we look at some of the IETF's holy cows, including its focus on openness rather than closed governance, on individual participation, not organizational affiliation, best technical solutions, not political or economic, and also humming, not voting, one would say that the IETF is a place where civil society thrives, a place where they get a legitimate seat at the table, and a place where they are amongst equals, right? Well, wrong, or rather, not as clear. The openness of the IETF as an organization has not been an unambiguous win for civil society. Counter to what some internet, oh, you're going a bit too fast, Niels. I mean, I could speed up if that's what you're trying to tell me, but counter to what some internet governance theorists and policymakers have assumed. It turns out that in practice, the IETF doesn't always live up to its hype of openness. And this makes sense when we consider sort of the broader political context of the IETF and the power disparities that exist here, especially sort of the importance and the influence of people who are what I call senior incumbents, so who have been coming here for 30 odd years, and of the private sector. And all of these power dynamics mean that just having procedural openness is truly not enough to level the playing field and make civil society easily included. Now, the IETF might be or might seem to be procedurally open, but when you employ ethnographic methods, like participating in IETF meetings, like interviewing, like talking to people, that demonstrates that there truly is a significant gap between the IETF's openness on paper and its openness in practice. Now, again, this might not be a huge surprise for the people in this room who are regular participants, but it is an important intervention nonetheless, especially because much of the academic literature, at least conversations within the communities that I'm part of, doesn't reflect the harsh reality of the IETF's functioning. And so what happens is civil society folks come here to participate and actually find themselves quite surprised by how occasionally toxic and somewhat abrasive it can be to be here. Next slide. So the gap between the rules on paper and in reality can be explained through some of the exclusionary effects of the IETF's culture. Now, this is by no means a holistic explanation. I am not Yuval Harari. I'm not trying to give you a single theory that explains it all. I don't believe those exist. But in my PhD, I name 4 specific cultural dynamics that make it difficult for civil society to join IETF discussions, even though their presence is needed. And these are the 4. But I also don't want to get ahead of myself. So before coming to the conclusions of my research, I want to talk a little about ethnography as a method, which is the ask that I got from Niels and Ignacio. Am I lost? Am I lost? Okay. Because that's a question I get a lot from people when they say, oh, I'm an anthropologist studying the IETF. They tend to ask me sort of, how did you end up here taking a left turn from studying people in remote islands to studying people who develop remote networking tools like the internet? Next slide. And it makes sense. It makes sense that that is the question that I get, because people tend to think of anthropologists as researchers who go off to faraway islands. Now, for all intents and purposes, being in Yokohama for me means I am on an island that is quite far away from where I regularly am. But this notion that anthropologists only study sort of the Argonauts of the Western Pacific to bring in some famous anthropological work is not what we do anymore. So since the 70s, there's been a shift in anthropological research called the the move to focus on our own societies and to look at people who are more powerful rather than people with less power, which also tended to be a classic sort of anthropological focus. And so that means that nowadays you will find us everywhere. Anthropologists are studying various governments, institutions like the European Commission, well-known tech companies like Google and Meta, and also perhaps somewhat lesser-known technical communities like the IETF. Next slide, please. Which brings me to the question of ethnography and how it works, essentially. So what anthropologists and other social scientists do is really study human behavior and culture, and we do that through direct engagement with humans that make these cultures, so we participate in their worlds, and in my case, that meant spending multiple years doing fieldwork here in the IETF. And what this type of research does is that it enables us to understand the cultural conditions that shape how technology gets made. And I'll make that concrete through the case study that I'll be presenting today. And what I will essentially show is that the IETF's rhetoric around its openness, its accessibility, and humming notwithstanding, it can be a really closed off and inaccessible organization to many civil society participants. Next slide, please. Which brings me, well, this is what we do. Clearly, Niels and I are out of sync. Next slide. Which brings me to the case study and the hard work of the hum. So now there are a number of IETF rituals and sort of holy cows that I could have unpacked for their exclusionary effects, especially to civil society. For example, the travel and language and visa barriers that a lot of people face given the IETF's traveling circus setup, or it's abrasive working practices that can conflate a rough demeanor with quality assurance for outcomes. But what I actually want to do is focus on a little bit more of a subtle cultural dynamic where you can truly see how ethnographic research is key to understanding the nitty-gritty of how the IETF works. Next slide, please. So for those new to the IETF, one of the things that makes it a quirky place is that people in this organization say they don't vote but hum. And that is one of the mechanisms by which decisions are made. Next slide, please. So that brings me to the hum's stated purpose, at least. So just for the folks at home who might not have experienced a hum yet, I'm going to try and call one. So everyone who thinks that, let's see, Niels is wearing black and that black is a great color to be wearing at the IETF, please hum now. Thank you. Everyone, oh God. Hi, DKG.
I just wanted to, this is Daniel. I wanted to amend the hum because I don't think the options are appropriate. You put two options together.
I was going to go for 3.
Okay, but you clustered the two together, and I might think that Niels is wearing black, but I don't think that it's appropriate for the IETF.
All right. Okay, how do I make this question better? I do not want to be written up for a code of conduct violation as I give this talk. I think the point is clear. A, this is how the hum works. B, it's contentious in practice. And I appreciate DKG for showing what it really looks like. And next slide.
There are people on the queue talking about the hum. There are people in the queue wanting to talk about the hum and running their hum also for remote. So I'm not sure if this illustrates your point or whether you'd like.
No, this will illustrate the point. This is great. I've now created the chaos that will illustrate the point. So essentially, as mentioned, the traditional hum is supposed to be a tool to help making decisions in the IETF working groups. Instead of having their votes recorded, as such, IETF participants hum. And this allows voting, between quotes, in the relative privacy of a collective resonance. Let me just find the correct page. So what the hum also does, and this is where ethnography comes in, what the hum also does is that it makes it harder to discern which engineers put their voice behind what proposals. And ostensibly, this particular procedure aligns with the IETF's idea of cultural openness and its emphasis on openness, because it seems to enable engineers to participate in the IETF as individuals rather than as corporate or otherwise affiliated representatives. And many engineers actually end up praising this particular form of procedural openness because it allows them to, again, vote against proposals their companies might support. Next slide. Oh, no, previous slide. So how can we see power by ethnographic study of the hum? Well, one way is by understanding the less evident social consequences the hum has by studying it from the ground up. And doing so, at least in my PhD, I show that as much as the hum enables individual participation, it also, to a certain extent, obfuscates the importance of your affiliation. And so the practice of the myth of participation, of individual participation notwithstanding, obviously affiliation matters greatly in the IETF. The opinions of engineers who work for companies that account for a large percentage of internet traffic or dominant in the browser market, and these sometimes are the same companies, can deeply influence technical debates. And so what we see is that in practice, procedural openness or accessibility or quirky kind of ways to go about running your working group does not necessarily mean that civil society can participate in the same way that some heavyweights do, even though they do represent a large online constituency. And open though as it may be, the hum also demonstrate that the IETF is a place where affiliation matters. Next slide. And now my fieldwork informed these findings, and spending some time within the IETF showed that the role of the hum in practice is divergent from its role on paper. Next slide. So for example, when I asked participants about the role of the hum, they would tell me that it also does precisely this, that it helps to sustain the myth that the IETF is open, because it seems to, or as one of the IETFs, one of the interviewees said, it seems like it avoids legal scrutiny and participation because it seems like it's just a bunch of engineers talking. But this in turn also means that, you know, the power differentials that exist here stay in place and become harder to name. Next slide. And then that leads me to the question of how do you theorize that? So it is often companies that benefit from the narrative of open individual participation that the hub enables. Because as individual participants rather than corporate employees, engineers are less vulnerable, or their companies are less vulnerable to antitrust litigation and unwanted government interventions. Next slide. So, what these subtle cultural conditions show, as simple as a collective out-breath consensus mechanism, is a real world of nuance, of political and economic factors influencing so-called technical discussions. And the reason why I wanted to talk about ethnography today is that I believe it's a complementary approach to the more sort of quantitatively focused work that RASP seems to be doing in terms of mailing list analysis and other data sets. Because if we only went by discussions on mailing list, or we only looked at the IETF's documents, all of this rich nuance would be lost. We wouldn't be able to like analytically close the gap between what the IETF says it does and how it actually functions. And I think insight into the latter are really key to any sort of serious rasping and grasping of the standardization process. Thank you so much. Happy to hear people's feelings about the hum, because apparently there are many.
I saw that there is a debate and questions in the chat. Would people like to put themselves in the queue? Oh, there are people in the queue. Susan, can you come in and unmute yourself? Or come
Thank
to the
you.
mic.
Are you able to hear me?
We can hear you loud and clearly. Thank you.
Thank you, Corinne. Thank you again for the interesting presentation. I want to know how critical the hum was to your discussion, since I have been in the IETF for over 30 years, and as a working group chair for most of that time. We do not tend to judge consensus based on the hum of the room, but rather a mailing list agreement, non-agreement. So I was trying to get a little clarification on whether your hum is simply the working group hum, or if you're looking at the process of judging consensus on a working group side, because that's the way the actual decisions occur.
Yes. So the hum, in terms of my PhD, not something I focus on a lot, precisely because of what you just outlined. So if you look at the IETF's document, to my understanding of it, it actually inflates the importance of the hum, whereas a lot of working groups tend to find consensus in different ways. But that is something that you don't know until you come here to see it. So my point is more about showing that there is a disparity between the IETF, how it functions on paper and in practice, and what the political implications are of that disparity.
I would perhaps offline like to discuss that a little further. I thought, based on our revisions of the working group documents, that it was fairly clear how the working group chairs are empowered to judge consensus based on the mailing group process. So I'm fascinated by your work. I appreciate your trying to take us from fiction to reality, but I'd like to dig a little deeper into details. Thank you.
Always happy to.
There are 4 more people in the queue. I'm going to lock the queue because we have 4 more talks, but definitely invite the people that are already here to ask their questions and make their comments to Corinne. Stefan, please go ahead.
Stefan Bartmeyer. I noticed, because Niels insisted on it, that we are not supposed to benchmark IETF against other SDO. But still, it could be interesting because the fact that there is a difference between the theory, how the IETF describes itself, and the reality, this fact is hardly specific to the IETF. No. For instance, the fact that there is the informal networking between people often matters more than official and documented process. Also, it's the same, I believe, in every human organization, no?
No, this is a very fair point. A lot of the basics from where I start the conversation are not different. If you go to human rights organizations, you will find that there are informal networks, that there are different practices. But where it becomes different and exclusionary is that the way of these informal practices in the IETF are exclusionary in ways that you might not find in other organizations, right? So in my PhD, I, for instance, look at the fact that this is an organization that prides itself in a certain type of abrasiveness that you can trace back to masculine practices of work, right? Of which other academics have said that type of practice is actually actively disencouraging for folks who don't ascribe to those kind of practices, who don't identify as male. And that is where the IETF is different. So saying we have informal networks, we have specific working practices, every place does. But when you look at the details of how those are playing out here, you can actually say, oh, some of the things that we do here make this organization very unpleasant for a specific subset of its participants. And I do think you can say that's a problem that we're needing to address.
Alistair Woodman, please go ahead.
Hi. So I'm not surprised in any way by your findings. So the de facto behavior of the IETF, I think, is well understood. I once gave you my personal feedback on how this organization actually works and what its intended goals are. Most people who attend the IETF and can afford to follow the circus around are being paid by companies and organizations that have a serious vested interest. Civil society folks, don't have the money in the budget to follow the circus around, and usually the technological background and interesting stuff is so arcane that why would they waste their time? So it is entirely not surprising that the end result is what you've measured. The fact that the IETF may have a different charter or says it does something to what the reality is obviously a disconnect, which everybody probably laughs about in private. So one could sort of take it up to management, if you wanted to sort of put it that way, and said, you know, change the branding because it's not actually, you're not doing what you're saying you're doing. Or you can say you want to change the stuff down in the engine room. The engine room has always been this way. Yeah. That's how it works. That's how stuff gets done, how stuff gets shipped out. I mean, the sort of technical things, it does tend to get a little bit detailed about things, but people are trying to ship product, right? Yeah. That's the purpose of what goes on here. People send, companies with lots of money send people here because they want to ship product. The cooperation occurs because they recognize that it doesn't make sense to build something that is proprietary because consumers won't buy it. And consumers are typically enterprises and other large entities. So it's a trading of a marketplace. And
the question is?
I don't think there's a question there. It's mostly a statement, right? I mean, I don't think you were expecting anything different, right? You're just reflecting to us the way that it works.
The interesting thing about this presentation is that it speaks to two different audiences. Why, and this is why I said like this might not be a surprise to the folks in the room, but if you look at the academic literature about the IETF, nowhere apart from my PhD will you find someone saying, yes, it's procedurally open, it's culturally very thorny. So I don't know if that's a disconnect between academics who write about this place or if they are not trained in the method of ethnography, so they go off by other things. And that is a problem because those academics are read by policymakers. Those policymakers subsequently say, oh, we should make sure that civil society gets to go here. Grant makers will say, oh, we're going to create grants so people can come here. And they come here with that misalignment of I can come here and equally participate, and it's just not the case. And so I think in that sense, my work is also an academic intervention to say, like, we need to look a little bit more closer about what is actually going on here and describing it for how it is versus for how people either would like it to be or for what you can find when you don't come here, but you only look at the documents.
Okay,
I'm
yeah,
very
okay.
thankful. I want to deeply thank Corinne, but ask also the other people from the queue to take the discussion. Okay, Dan is okay. Dan, come on.
But appreciate it if you keep it succinct because we're starting to run.
Okay, I'll be succinct. Dan Harkins. So I'm wondering, in your ethnographic research, what other standards bodies did you investigate for how they arrived at consensus?
So for my work, I've looked primarily at the IETF, but I've participated in the IEEE and in ICANN. I have some experience with Senelec, but the true ethnographic work has only been here.
So you mentioned that you thought the hum was bad, well, had bad characteristics because it obfuscated and afforded privacy to affiliation, which I think is probably actually a good thing in that it prevents the kind of block voting that you see in other organizations where they have company A will raise their hand, and so all the affiliated companies will go, oh, if they're voting that way, then you magically see 37 other hands raised because those hands were raised. And I think the hum actually prevents that kind of subtle control of the working group. So while the hum is probably not the greatest thing in the world, I think it's better than any of the alternatives.
I appreciate that. And I'll sit down now so you can move on. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Corinne.
One more quick applause. Thanks so much.
And now to something else completely different, moving from qualitative to quantitative. We have Stephen McQuiston from Glasgow University, St Andrews, with data-driven reviewer recommendations.
Can I
The
control
floor is
this?
yours. And appreciate it if you can keep strictly to the time and ideally leave a little bit for questions.
Can I control with this?
Oh, you want it? Yes. Okay. Granted.
Thank you. Yep, so I'm Stephen McQuiston from the University of Glasgow, and today I'm going to talk about data-driven reviewer recommendations. So this is work that's been part of the SodaStream project, and the SodaStream project is a collaboration between the University of Glasgow and Queen Mary University of London. So just to begin with a quick overview of what that project entails, the premise here is that, as we know, the IETF decision-making process is complex, it's dynamic, and it contains interaction between participants that have different interests, perhaps conflicting interests and priorities. Now, at the other side of that, we know that much of the data around these decisions is publicly available. So in terms of outputs, we've got all of the internet drafts and RFCs that IETF produces. On the other side, behind those documents, we've also got the mailing list interactions, we've got meeting minutes, attendance records, all of the data that the data tracker keeps about participation in the IETF's activities. So the question that the project's trying to answer then is, can we use all of this open, publicly available data to try and identify perhaps where decision-making isn't going well and to develop tools and methods for trying to improve that decision-making process? Now, the example that I'm going to talk about today is developing a tool for recommending internet draft reviewers. This is motivated in part by some of the observations we've made around about errata filings and what they say about the quality of documents. So if we look at all of the standards track RFCs, about a third of them attract at least one errata filing. Now that varies by area. It goes up to about 40% for security area RFCs. But importantly, we found that looking at all of the errata filings, about 7% of them are filed within 30 days of the RFC being published. Now that doesn't necessarily mean that that was something obvious that could have been picked up, but we want to ask the question, based on that figure, can we improve the review phase so that we can try and reduce the volume of errata that get filed? Can we pick good reviewers to get better documents, essentially? Okay, so this is going to be data-driven. So we're going to draw data from across the IETF. We're going to look at internet drafts and RFCs. We're going to look at participant metadata from the data tracker. And we're going to look at how participants interact with each other on the IETF public mailing lists. Now, the essential method that we're going to use here is we're going to try and distill down internet drafts into a sort of vector that describes the topics and the themes that are present in those drafts. And then similarly, we're going to look at each participant in the mailing lists and try and distill their participation down into a vector that describes the topics and terms that they use on the mailing lists. We're then going to compare those two vectors and try and produce a recommended set of reviewers based on that. Now, one of the methods that we're going to use to try and distill down documents into a vector is called TF-IDF. That stands for Term Frequency Inverse Document Frequency. Now, that method produces two numbers per term that we see in each document. So I've got a quick example here on the screen. We produce two numbers. So we have this term here, the. We have the frequency of the word the in a particular document. So it appears in this document 341 times. And then we produce the inverse document frequency. So we relate the frequency in this particular document to the whole set of internet drafts. So you can imagine that the word the appears in almost all internet drafts. And so its inverse document frequency is very low. It's 0, right? The word the doesn't really characterize a document. If it appears across all the documents, having a high number of occurrences of the word the doesn't really tell me which document I'm looking at. By contrast, if we look at quick up at the top, it appears 30 times in this particular draft. But then again, if we look across all of the internet drafts, the word quick doesn't really appear in many of them at that scale. And so it has a relatively high inverse document frequency. And so that's what this algorithm is trying to do. We're trying to take all of the terms that we see in the internet draft, produce the frequency of the words that we see, and also look at how characteristic those terms are of the document that I'm looking at against the full set of documents. Now we're going to do that not only for the drafts, but also for participants as well. So what we're doing here is essentially the same method, this term frequency, inverse document frequency that I just described. But this time we're going to take all of the interactions that a given participant has had, all of the contributions they've made to public IETF lists. We're going to concatenate them together across a 5-year span, and then we're going to produce this vector just in the same way. So this time, instead of characterizing a document, we're characterizing the participant in terms of their mailing list interactions. Okay, so now we've got these two vectors. We've got one for every single internet draft that's been produced, and then we've got one for every single participant that's participating in IETF mailing lists. And so we're then just going to compare these two. We're going to use something called cosine similarity, which basically plots these two vectors in 2D space and looks for the distance between them. And we're going to produce a recommended set of reviewers that is essentially based on how far apart these two vectors are. So we're going to say this is a draft that contains the terms quick and congestion window. I should look for reviewers whose topics in the mailing list discussions align with the topics of that draft, which seems fairly straightforward. Now we've developed this tooling, and as a quick aside, this tooling is A/B testing a couple of different strategies that I'm not going to describe here. So I described TF-IDF for producing these vectors. We also test a method called LDA, which works in much the same way. It produces a vector of topics. And I described cosine similarity for comparing the two vectors. But we also test machine learning techniques for doing the same job. As I say, we've developed this tool. This is a screenshot of it here. It's fairly straightforward to use. So I'm going to ask you for the name of the draft that you want reviewer recommendations for. By default, when you press search, it's going to give you a list of 5 names, 5 participants that it thinks would be good reviewers for that draft that you've asked about. It'll give you links to their data tracker profile, and it'll give you a list of the drafts that they've authored, just to give you a bit more context about that person and why they might be a good reviewer for the draft. You can see drop-down boxes along the right-hand side. That's just to give us some feedback about whether or not the reviewers that we're suggesting or the tool's suggesting, whether or not they are good choices. Those are automatically fed back into the model and hopefully will mean that we make better suggestions further on. You can see this mode drop-down here. By default, we're looking for people, given the method that I just described, for people that are most similar to the draft you're looking for reviewers for. But there's a couple of other modes. You can ask for reviewer expertise in a given IETF area. So perhaps you want security, people that are active in the security area. So it will only consider contributions to security mailing lists. And then the third mode asks you for a list of existing reviewers for the draft, and the tool will then try and find complementary reviewers. So it'll look for people that are dissimilar to the set of people that are already looking at your draft. So as I say, this is publicly available. I will leave the QR code and the link up on the screen while I sum up, so you can furiously scan this. And I'd really appreciate that if you are looking for reviewers, then you can use the tool, but also that you try it out on drafts that you're familiar with, just to see whether or not the tooling is coming up with sensible choices. As I say, this is an experiment, so you will be given choices that perhaps are not great. Tell us about them, and it can all be fed back into the model. So just to wrap up, this is just one part of the SodaStream project. It's one sort of instantiation of how we can use the tooling and the data sets that we've developed. We're aware that there are many, many more questions that we can think about and answer using this tooling and these data sets that we've gathered. We've previously looked at the social graph of the IETF and the impact that that has on deployment. But again, there's lots of other questions out there, and we're very keen to collaborate with anyone that's got those questions and that wants to use our data and our tooling to try and answer them. The link to the project's on the screen, as is my email address. Again, very keen for people to reach out and to form some collaborations. Thank you.
Thanks so much. There are 4 people in the queue, and I'm going to lock the queue because there are more people. But the person who's not in the queue, but was the previous presenter, I'll give privilege. There you go. Go ahead, Corinne.
Thanks, Stephen, so much. I had a question about if and how this can account for social dynamics, right? Because we know, for instance, from academic reviewing, that sometimes when you submit a paper, you are allowed to specifically name academics that you think should not be reviewing your paper, right, because you don't think they'll give you a fair review, because there is some professional, but sometimes also some personal tension between you and said person.
Yeah.
If you don't mind, I'm going to take a couple of questions, and then you can.
Yes.
So, Susan, please come in.
Hi. Corinne mentioned something that's very practical. You sent out this wonderful tool to the list. I tried it out, and I tried it out on one of my drafts that is contentious. And it turned up one of those people, and it also missed the fact that there are contributing authors as well as editors. Highly contentious document. I was fascinated to see. Keep working on the tool. Glad to give you more details. I look forward to using it in my working group.
Thank you.
DKG.
Hi, this is also a very neat tool. Are you going to build the tool that says, I'm looking to review a document, can you prioritize one that I should be looking at?
That's interesting, yeah. So, I mean, we've got the data, and certainly we can just flip
Run
it.
Put it in reverse.
Definitely. Good suggestion.
That was very similar to my question. I have a requisite comment or a question and a comment, but the first one is with mailing list data. Do you code or have any insight into who's saying what? Because I mean, I would note that often in mailing lists, because there's so much quote text, that even humans have a hard time figuring out what's the comment and what's the original text.
Yeah, so we have considered that, and the tooling does strip out quote text and not attribute it to the person that's quoting, but to the person that made the original.
Okay, sometimes people like brackets, and anyway, it's a bit of a mess, as I'm sure you know.
Yeah,
okay, so then my comment was about the tool, which I also did. I went and put in some of my drafts. I did note, though, that there's some folks I think in the IETF that maybe are really good at writing and producing documents, and they have a lot of RFCs that might overlap with that. And then there are other folks I think that do more reviews, and I don't know how that shows up, but I would just say that, and also we say to new entrants in particular, like reviewing documents is a good way of getting into things.
Yeah.
So that doesn't necessarily uncover new participants because they haven't written anything or have anything RFC'd yet. So I just wanted to make that comment. You don't have to fix it.
Yeah, and I think related to that, we don't cover sort of people that attend meetings, but perhaps are not as active on the mailing list, or people that author documents, but again, are not perhaps active in the mailing list. And I think bringing in that data is useful, but also then flagging up where we're getting the recommendation from, so that it ties in with what Corinne was saying. Perhaps we don't want to bias towards in-person attendees, for example. That wouldn't be good, but just bringing all of that in and making it clear where it's coming from, I think would be the strategy.
And then the final part of the queue, Alexander Aurelian.
Thanks. My question is whether you could tell us more details about the nature of the categories of the errors that were found. Are we talking about typos and style, or you misplaced a plus and a minus and then the rocket blew up? Because in one case, you need people with long time experience to fix it. And in another case, you could delegate it to new participants and it would also be effective.
Yes, that's a good point. So the errata filing statistics that I showed were the motivation perhaps behind the tooling, but we don't tie it then back to how it then fixes errata. But I've got much more detail about the statistics we found. I think to answer Corinne's point, we think that making data-driven choices is perhaps better than not making data-driven choices. So I think that overall we would reduce the sort of human biases that you're talking about, but it's not perfect. And I think just making clear what the tooling's doing and how it's driving its choices perhaps gets some of the way there, if that makes sense. Yeah, I think I've answered.
Thanks so much, Stephen. And really appreciate it. Also, take further comments, please, to the mailing list. Also, because of your comments, your ideas, we might develop new research questions and new directions, right? So now, without further ado, we continue to Sebastian Benthal on expanding the universe of Big Bang.
Monitor, and there's no clicker. So I just say,
Yeah, or say, wave your hand,
Okay.
say next slide.
Hello, this is my first IETF. It's nice to be here. I'm at a law school. I'm not a lawyer. I'm a research scientist. I realized during Corinne's talk that I've been reading ethnographic work on internet governance for 10 years because I did my doctorate in the department with Nick Doty, who spent a lot of time here, and Ashwin Matthew. And I've been working with Niels on stuff and been meeting Corinne through this. So I've studied you in a lot of ways, but this is my first time actually meeting you. So hi. Click. Yeah, and so the reason why I'm here is because I'm involved in an open source software community that's been around for a while. And what it is an open source community, and we're building research infrastructure for the analysis of infrastructure governance and standard setting processes. And it has a bunch of contributors from a lot of different organizations, and it's able to have all these different contributors from different organizations because it's set up like an open source community. Click. So let's see, like 2018, we had a release which among other things had like a gender detection feature, but also had its governance document and a code of conduct. Got to get those in. But things started to really pick up around 2021 because Article 19 sponsored a sprint at I think the hackathon there, and that led to another release where we're looking at tenure calculation, how long people are in the IETF, how long they're participating, looking at who they're affiliated with, doing entity resolution on people's names. We're interested in a lot of different data sources, including like W3C, 3GPP, SDOs more generally, though we do love the IETF. And then we had a support from the Prototype Fund, which led to another release in 2022, which really improved our documentation, gave us support for sort of hand annotated data sets, which is really important for training machine learning models. Started working with Stephen McQuiston's data tracker stuff. Love him. There's a lot of work now on the attendance and the draft analysis that we can sort of integrate with the toolkit. And now we're here. And in preparation for this meeting, essentially, we've had a lot of interesting work on a new dashboard prototype. We've had great hackathon contributions, and we're here at this meeting. So slide. All right. So I think the thing that kind of sets us apart and sort of explains the longevity of the project is that from the beginning, it was sort of modeled on other successful open source communities with like a lightweight governance process, which keeps going, right? So it's essentially governed by consensus of the core developers or core committers. Who are the core developers? It's people that are active or consistent in their contributions. And if someone is active and consistent enough in their contributions, they might be recognized by consensus of the other people who are active and consistent in their contributions. And then they're in. And then they have responsibilities because they have to review other people's work and they've got to attend the meetings, et cetera. And if they stop being active, they can phase out and become kind of emeritus until they have time to come back in or whatever. But it's basically a project that's run by whoever's participating in it. And that keeps it fresh and means people have been coming in and out over time. And if there's a big like disruptive change someone wants to make, like we had one like, what if we stopped using flat files and really put in a database? Well, we really have to talk about that. So you're familiar with iterative proposal processes. There's a lightweight version of that in open source communities where we'll work things out, try to get consensus, and then once we've got consensus, move on and try to implement it. That's the process. So at the hackathon, we had a lot of great stuff. Michael Lee from The Intercept was like a walk-in, started delivering a bunch of interesting like docs improvements and also a command line interface that replaces some of our old scripts. Effie Lee, who's presenting later, made a pull request for her named entity recognition stuff. I'm not going to steal her fire, but it's great stuff. We're glad to have it in the repository. Crazy experience. Again, first time attend the new attendees dinner. Jay Daly's running around, literally refilling wine cups. I talked to him and he's like, what I want to know is if on the mailing lists, men and women are talking to each other differently, like with different sentiment, right? So Priyanka picks up the problem and now we've got a PR for that. So the tools are there for like a lot of the components of analysis for pre-processing are there to make it easy to answer a new question. That's kind of the design of the library. Got it? Slide. So the prototype dashboard, this is cool. So the way the project's set up, it's like a Python package. It's scientific Python libraries. It's alienating to some people. It's alienating even if you have background in scientific Python because it's difficult to install packages sometimes. But also, not everybody's a programmer, right? So what if we have a hosted dashboard for the analytics? So you can go say, I'm interested in drafts, I'm interested in working groups, I'm interested in people, and then see the kinds of analytics that we've already worked out, but available as sort of interactive widgets. Well, we've got a demo of that. But as soon as you start doing that, sorry, back up. As soon as you start doing that, you start getting into this like data protection issues. And basically, like a lot of people working in the space also do policy research. So we're already holding ourselves to the fire and saying, well, like, what are we going to do? Like, we've got to, what's the privacy policy on the IETF? Like, how do we do this ethically? So Neil's got some pro bono lawyers to advise us on what to do. Under the GDPR, there's a legitimate basis for data processing, which is research in the public interest. And so we've got this sign-on process where you can fill out a form, tell us who you are, tell us you agree that you're doing this research in the public interest. You know, we've got something in place. Slide. All right, so prototype is up. We're still working on it. We've got some new PRs on it on the hackathon, haven't yet merged them in. We're sort of focusing for now on the working group analytics, which are the most developed part of the Big Bang tools. And this is a nice thing because now we can get user studies, get feedback on how to develop to the next phase. And boy, have we had ideas about how to develop in the next phase. We're just overflowing with ideas. It's great. Slide. And so in conversation with people like Ignacio and Gareth and other people, we're thinking about what if there was like a RASP research infrastructure that had, you know, the IETF data sources and maybe other standards development organization data sources, right? And then also like the hand annotated data that we need to do like data enrichment, machine learning on top of it. So we've got the primary data sources, and then we work out secondary data sources using these processes, make that available in like a database, and then hook that up to an API, and then have multiple different kinds of applications targeting different kinds of users. So policy researchers, leadership, academics, you know, think about that. Slide. Okay, lots of ethics and legal issues, which I think is great. I'm a legal scholar, so I love it. So then it's like, well, what's the API, right? Is that a data intermediation service under the Data Governance Act? Maybe. In that case, it would have fiduciary duties to the data subjects under this law that's coming in September, which means it has to be good for us. And that means we can like really think about what that really means. And that's a really interesting research question. On the other hand, we have to make sure that all the downstream applications are appropriately bound to the purpose that they are built for and that they have their legitimacy in place. And then, of course, there's all the critiques of the current laws and how they're inadequate. Papers, wonderful papers we can write. Think about it. Also, wonderful data and research we can do. That's what research infrastructure is for. Slide. Right. So, all right, we're done. So that's QR codes, man. QR codes. I didn't think of that. Standardsandgovernance.net. You can go to it to try out this form, see our login process, try the demo, and then we're on github.active-bigbang.active-dashboard. What if that's at github-RASPRG-bigbang? What if we made that? We could put all our tools together in a GitHub organization and have that be a thing. That's what I want to see. That's my talk. No questions.
I think that means consensus. Thanks so much, Seb. Excellent. And then now we continue with Priyanka to show some of the work Priyanka has been doing on this.
Hi, I'm Priyanka. No, you can see right there. Oh, great. Hi, I'm Priyanka. I am a computer scientist, and I recently just completed my PhD in mining personality traits, individual personality traits, and behaviorally similar groups from enterprise social media. And I have a background in networking, right? Did my master's in wireless networks, worked with routers for a while, debugging mostly routing code. So this is my first IETF though. So next slide. So I wanted, in this talk, I'm just going to summarize the work we've done in the previous IAB workshop regarding applying my techniques to in IETF data, and a few more methodologies, algorithms that might be relevant for us, and what are the few questions I'm interested in at the moment. And I am trying to motivate why doing this for the IETF is actually probably going to solve problems for other people as well. Let's go. So this is a temporal activity time series clustering algorithm that I've applied on the V6, IPv6 operations working group. And as you can see that people who are talking a lot at the same time, there are peaks. Those peaks are probably people talking about the same thing. Maybe they have a different position, but they're talking about the same thing. And this kind of an algorithm helps find out people who have different email addresses, but are the same person. Next slide. I've repeated that for the MPLS cluster, and you can see that with the peaks, they probably have the similar viewpoint or interest, but if you do more content analysis for these people, you may find out whether they have the same opinion about those topics or not. Yeah, and you can see that the people that are there, for people who have been in the IETF for a long time, you can see that they are very, you wouldn't normally think that they are all interested in the same, because they have very different affiliations. If this is the interdomain routing cluster, and even though these people have different affiliations, which is looks like from their email addresses, I myself have worked with most of these, so I know that they have similar interests in similar groups, and they're part of the same cluster using these, just the temporal activity clustering. So that might help IETF find out those who have the same technical aspect of interest in the same topics, and speed up the process of consensus. Next, this is for the CCAMP cluster, and because we have so many different types, so many different kinds of affiliation in the same cluster, these are people who have the similar topic or the similar behavior. It means motivation for the IETF to look beyond demographics and affiliations. Next slide. This is all MPLS, IDR, CCAMP, all of them together. And this in this cluster, you can see that Adrian, everybody's familiar with at IETF, and all his different email addresses come up in the same cluster. That means we are able to find him. And in the same cluster, we find people who are from Korea, right? So this kind of entity disambiguation really helps for downstream text mining or richer analytics for the IETF. Next slide. So this is another technique. I haven't applied it to the IETF data yet, but I would like to. It is a causal learning framework using formal methods, wherein I am able to analyze. So these mailing list conversations or meeting transcripts, these are dialogue traces, conversation. I think some of you have been to the VCon working group, BOF, sorry, and you might be interested. So here we can find out what are the causes, like temporal causes or things that are in the minds of the participants, the psycholinguistic aspects, which lead to consensus, which doesn't lead to consensus, which leads to certain outcomes of the conversations that we might be interested in, and even how it is flowing, right? So these are good techniques in that sense. Next slide. We can, one thing that many people think about when you do network analysis is that we are only focused on the number of messages people communicate with each other when you consider represented in a graph. Well, now you don't need to. Now you can have various different parameters or aspects of your communication as a rich multi-edge graph, including empath, which is psycholinguistic aspects of the author towards another author, not just sentiments. And then you are able to use this to mine people who are similar to each other, individual people who are similar to each other, groups which are similar to each other. Maybe you may call them factions or anything else, but that may be grounded not only in terms of their opinion and sentiments, but also maybe in their technical interests. You know, not all discussion on mailing lists, and especially in IETF, the homophily is due to some sentiment. Next. So there's some computational psycholinguistic studies that I have done. I have confirmed from big data that use of first-person personal pronouns, excessive use, is an indication of depression. And also that in mining these things, right, mining openness is much easier than mining things like honesty, right? So these kind of things are useful when we do these kind of, apply these kind of techniques on analysis. Next. So I want to motivate, because diversity is something everybody is interested in the IETF. I want to just position this point that we need to look beyond demographics and affiliation because people are multidimensional. Maybe whatever demography or whatever affiliation a person is may not be the reason why they have a particular position, whether it is technical or otherwise, which is why data-driven analytics is so important. These are the two questions that I'm interested in currently, and I'm working with the Big Bang group for the contextual integrity in terms of group behavior and understanding the decision-making processes that lead to the production of publications. I think both these questions are important to the IETF and the RASPRG. Next. And I would like to tell you why I think that IETF data studying these things is important and is valuable. These computational methods are important because this is good data. I mean, for somebody, for their PhD who has had to work on this, this is great data. This is a great data which has large engagement from various demographies and affiliations. It has semi-formal text. It's less noisy, not short text. That's great for text mining. And there are many turns of dialogues. There are several messages in the thread. So that's discourse analysis is possible. And there are active open source tools like Big Bang, SourceStream, IETF data, which can be used for these. So there's a chance that by doing this, we can have a universal behavior model for people, at least for this community. And it can provide, maybe it can even provide better insight into for other people to find out what are the possible human factors analysis for other aspects of research in other groups like maybe autonomous vehicles. But it could also be a resource for psychologists, ethnographers, and cognitive scientists to test their hypothesis computationally faster. Next. I think Seb has done this. Next. So you can see all my presentations, technical work at YouTube, at my channel. I have the talks, most of them up there. The details, you can follow me on Twitter, add me on LinkedIn. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Priyanka. There are two people in the queue. So the first to come in, please, Corinne Kath.
Hey, Priyanka, this is super helpful. Thank you for presenting. So I had sort of a practical methodological question. The problems that any kind of these tools always run into is that some of the things that you measure are in the eye of the beholder. Gender being a really good example, right? Like most people, or a lot of people tend to maybe not fall on a binary, whereas these kind of methods tend to say you are a 1 or a 0, you are male or female, and that's just not the reality of the place. And related to that, I was wondering how you dealt with issues around the fact that what is considered to be offensive, yes or no, is highly cultural determined, and like how you take these kind of nuances into control whilst also wanting to be able to say something that's useful.
Yes, thank you. So that is how my PhD or my work differs. And this was a comment I had at my defense as well, is that why am I not considering the demographic attributes as features in my analysis? I don't. So I'm not labeling my the people that I'm doing as any label of male, female, binary, non-binary. So when you run my algorithms, they are data driven directly. So they're unsupervised. So they're not labeled. So if there are, let's say in the population, let's say 10 different genders, then they will come up as 10 different clusters. So I cannot label them. I may be able to label them if I know that somebody in that cluster is of a particular gender, then I can label that gender that way. But otherwise, I am not the person doing that labeling. So that is, I wouldn't say that that's bias free because the data itself might be biased, but I'm saying that it's better than having a coarse gender attribute as a feature. That's all I'm saying. And for toxicity, I think offensiveness and toxicity, I have not yet done any analysis on toxicity. It's a very current research problem. I have reviewed work for that, but I haven't myself made any contributions to that area. But I'd love to work on it. Thank you.
And then Susan Harris, and after that, the queue is closed because we got still one more presentation left. So Susan, please come in. Susan?
The mic is, I'm here. The mic is sometimes delayed this time when we're across the globe. Sorry for the delay. First of all, wonderful work. I got a chance to look at some of this ahead of time. Fascinating. 2 questions. First, one thing, having been in some of those clusters, IDR being one you might find me in, I think you might have some skewing by the fact that some people are chairs, and I'm not sure if
Yes.
you took into account that skew. So you might want to look at that in the actual data. 2, how did you get around some of the legal problems in the classifications or the use of some of this data? Was that something that your dissertation community had requested? Some of the work I did was reviewed by committees, and they recommended me to not go into some of this data due to subjects' willingness to do this or to look at this. Are the legal constraints of the open list truly open, or are they not? And it's just a data gathering. How did you get around this? Because this problem was interesting, but I steered away.
Thank you so much, Susan, for those very insightful questions. So for the skew part, that's a technical thing. I only, if somebody is more active, I have not put a upper limit on that. I haven't handled that skew. I can be honest about that. But for the lower participation, that people who have participated maybe one email in 10 years, those people I have not considered. So that's the answer to your skew question. But yes, I would like to talk further about what you have thoughts on the skew. The other aspect is the one about the data. Susan, I would like to tell you that I have had a lot of problems with this, and I can go at length about the issues that I've had, and which is why I'm very hopeful of being part of the IETF and the RASPRG, because here, as Seb has pointed out, as long as it is in public interest, we can continue this research. More details I can go on in offline, Susan.
Thank you very much. And more of a question than a comment. Sorry, more of a comment than a question. A note of caution: when you use sentiment analysis, those and toxicity, those algorithms are typically trained on general language, so they are unaware of specificities of networking. So, for example, if you use the term kill switch, which in our context is perfectly fine, those models will typically interpret it as something negative, which it is not. So you might need to retrain it.
Yes, you have to fine tune.
Yeah,
you have to fine tune. Yes, exactly.
And thank you very much, Priyanka. Excellent work. And if Effie can come now to the stage to talk about large language models, that would be great. Or is it remote?
Hi, Effie. Great to see you. You already have slide control, so with the arrow to the right, you should be able to control the slides. And thanks so much for being here in a very weird time in Amsterdam.
Yeah. So hello, everyone. Can you hear me?
Yeah. Very well.
Good. So today I'm going to present my work using large language models for standards discourse analysis. So I'm Effie Xue Li. I'm from University of Amsterdam. I'm a PhD in AI and data science. So today my talk is going to cover large language models and also using named entity recognition with BERT and knowledge graph construction with GPT-3. So talking about large language models, I'm sure everyone has heard of ChatGPT and probably even used it in their work. And so the invention of ChatGPT has sparked explosive discussions both online and offline. So if we look at the search results for both BERT model and ChatGPT, the results are not comparable. BERT model is one of the first published large language models. So in this age, it derives a research question that I'm interested in. How can we use large language models for standards discourse analysis? So by the standards discourse, I used the mailing lists. And why am I interested in this? Because applying some statistical analysis for the metadata for the emails is feasible, but being able to analyze the email bodies, especially extract some useful information from the email bodies, is not very feasible, especially when it comes to a large scale mailing list. That's why I would like to leverage the power of the current large language models for this task. So for the curation of the mailing list, I'm using Big Bang package. We had a great presentation already on this, so I'm not going to go into details, but we do have a really cool dashboard with lots of interesting results. And so the first attempt I did with the emails is to apply this named entity recognition task. So the model I used was a BERT-based model, and then I fine-tuned the model with the CIRAC dataset. CIRAC dataset is a publicly available dataset, email dataset with annotations specifically for this task. That's why we can fine-tune this model. And now we can see some results for one sample email from a mailing list. We can see that the model is able to detect some entities with different types, such as persons and organizations and etc. And we can see the model is also making mistakes, obviously. And in the hackathon, I also extracted the top 10 frequent entities for each type that we have with the model. And I have some results for one mailing list from 3GB6. We can see, for example, for the type location, apparently people like to talk about San Francisco the most. And for the type person, we can see we have a different person's name with their counts. One thing to note is that, so the extracted person entities here with this model, they also align with the sender receiver information analysis from the metadata. So that also qualitatively validates our extraction. And here we have more extract entities for different types. So one interesting thing is it's very exciting to see the models is able to extract terms like RFC, Internet Protocol, and for the organizations, we can extract IETF, GPP, UE, etc. But the models also have lots of noises, for example, for this type digits. So all of these results are very exciting because it shows a great quantitative tool for extracting entity informations from the email bodies. And we can extract information with different types, but there are still some disadvantages. For example, we need the label dataset to fine-tune the model if we want to have good performance, but normally we don't have lots of label datasets. And also the model is limited with only a fixed set of types. So if you want to extract, for example, animals, you cannot with the current model. And also for this model, we can only extract entity information. So how can we go one step further? One interesting data format that we can extract is knowledge graph. So knowledge graphs are networks of real-world entities with their relationships. But extracting knowledge graphs for our mailing lists is challenging because we have a very specialized domain and we don't have a unified schema. But after we have those extracted knowledge graphs, we can imagine there are many more interesting applications. For example, we can store the extracted information into a structured data format, and they are connected, and we can do further intervention on them. So, so yeah, knowledge graphs are very useful, but how can we extract them? we use GPT-3. So GPT-3 is in the GPT model family, and the full name is Generative Pre-trained Transformers 3. One of its most obvious characteristics is that it's very huge. So GPT-3 has 175 billion parameters, but BERT has only 110 million parameters. So it means it's 1,500 times larger than BERT. And even compared to its own family, it's 100 times larger than the previous version, GPT-2. And the way that we use GPT-3 is to do prompt engineering with the OpenAI APIs. So we can ask literally any question, and we can ask it to extract not only entities, relations, and all information we want with different types. But one problem is we don't have any access to the underlying trained weights. So we cannot debug, we cannot do any intervention on the model itself. And also it costs money. So, but how is the results? Here we have two extracted knowledge graphs, one from the package KG creator and another with GPT-3. From just an overview, we can see with the GPT-3, we can extract a much more information enriched knowledge graph. But I know you cannot see the nodes and relations. That's why we also have tables. So with the knowledge graph extracted by the knowledge KG creator, we have very limited entities with their types, and we also don't have relations. But with GPT-3, we have not only entities with their types, we also have the relationships between them. And from this one overview, from this one example, we can see the quality is a lot better with GPT-3. So the way that we use GPT-3 is to design this natural language prompt. So here, the prompt I'm using is with one-shot example. So I first provide one example to the model. Here I provide one very generic example with extracted entities and relations. And then I just have to embed the email body to it. And the model can just does this magic. However, we still have limitations and concerns. So one of the biggest concern is that we have privacy and ethical issues. So I guess we would like not to send our data, especially if it's private, to another company. And also, it costs more when the amount of emails goes up. So for 2 million emails, it will cost around $17,000. And also, it's very slow. It takes around 1 minute to process one API call. And again, we don't have any control over these large GPT family models. But still, I'm still working on this research. So in the future, we would like to first denoise the results given some constraints, and we can optimize our prompts. And also would like to have a local model that can achieve comparable models, comparable performance with GPT-3. Thanks. That's it.
Thanks so much, Effie. Well, I'm super sorry, but we unfortunately don't have time for questions, but I hope this was an inaugural session in which you got like a little taster of the directions in which this research group can go, but the direction in which it will go, we will need to decide together. So please help us bring up your suggestions, comments, and ideas on the mailing list. Feel free to come up to us after the session or talk to us or the IETF chair after this. Thanks so much, presenters, for all your great research in all these different directions, for making it all open source, and looking forward to the next session. And in the meantime, happy hacking. See you later.
Thank you, everybody.
What were you saying? Okay. It's like